There are a lot of different ways that people have tried this, and there are big steps and there are little steps. And the big steps I recognize are not possible for a lot of teachers because, like you mentioned, at the end of the year we have to give students grades. Like our bosses tell us they have to have a grade, and there's nothing we can do about that. So a lot of those things, like you can't just get rid of grades in one day and have that be the end of it. So we have to take these little steps. What I have been able to do, and I have to take the teeniest of steps because at my current position, my hands are sort of tied, where I am literally forbidden from changing anything about the classes that I teach. But that's a whole other conversation, is the treatment of adjuncts. But something that I do is emphasize evaluation over grades. So I like minimize grades as much as possible. And one way that I do that, people think that you have to get rid of grades from like a course level. But what I do is get rid of grades from an assignment level, because that's a little step that you can take. So for instance, when students turn in rough drafts of papers, I never grade those because, why should students be judged on a work in progress? Like that is one thing that directly leads students to be afraid of mistakes and failure and to play safe. That's not good because that stifles creativity and risk taking and all good things that we want our students to do. So I never grade drafts, and I emphasize feedback. I give lots and lots of comments. One resource that I use for that and for how to give good feedback is Peter Elbow, who most of his work is in the field of composition, but he also talks a lot about pedagogy, and he's one of the early, gradeless adopters, especially in the composition field. And what he suggests is not writing on students' papers because that sort of perpetuates the power imbalance between students and teachers. And instead, what he would do is he would write letters to students, like a formal, like, dear so-and-so, and then multiple paragraphs describing his experience of reading their paper, what he felt worked, what he felt didn't work, suggestions, questions, stuff like that, and then would attach that to the paper. And I think that's really interesting because it brings up not just the power differential between students and teachers, but also the demoralization of any kind of feedback on student papers. Like even if you're just writing comments, students don't like to see writing all over their papers. It makes them feel like they've done something wrong, even if the comments are positive or constructive. Writing them a letter, I think, is it sounds simple, but it feels really radical because it's, you are treating your students like equals and you are treating them like adults and like real human beings. Those are some of the little steps that I take. Is just really emphasizing that feedback and evaluation, getting rid of grades on individual assignments as much as possible, even though you have to give a grade at the end of the semester in most cases.
Do you find that when you've switched from this model that it's difficult to have students comply? And I mean this in like it sounds bad, but it's a true factor of teaching that part of the job is students have to complete a certain number of assignments, typically based off of the rules of the course that are not usually assigned by the teacher to begin with. So the grades typically serve as a coercion model. It's how we ensure that students complete all of the assignments. And if there aren't grades being given, then, well, why would I do them? When you're in your composition classroom and you have students, let's say, not do a draft, how do you then get around that struggle?
This is one of those cases where teaching college, I think, gives me a lot more leeway than teaching, grade school or high school, because I just tell my students, you don't have to turn in a draft. It's not going to affect your grade at all. But the more that you give me to work with, the more I can help you. So it's like a help me help you kind of thing, where if they turn in a draft, then they get feedback and then their final project is better. But if they don't, then their final draft is what it is, and there was no opportunity for them to change it. Though I do offer like revision opportunities, but it's funny that you bring that up because in a class that I taught when I was at a different institution, when I was at a university that offered me a lot more freedom with how I taught things. There was a class that I used a project based structure for, and we can talk about that a little bit later if you want. As part of that, my students, I asked them to create their own rubrics basically for their projects. So, like, what does a successful project of whatever kind they were doing look like to you? And how do you figure out, what are like the elements that you need to judge to determine success, and like what are the levels of that? They hated it. They were miserable. So at the end of the semester, when we were reflecting on the projects, and I was asking them, like, from a structural, like, pedagogical point of view, like, what worked, like, what did you like about doing the projects? Pretty much almost universally, they were like, don't make us do the rubrics. Like, if you teach this class in the future, don't make them write their own rubrics. I think it was an issue on my part, or a miscommunication on my part, where I didn't make it clear enough why I was asking them to do it. And they were still in this headspace of, you're the teacher, you're going to be the one giving me the grade, you're the one who decides what a success is. Why don't you tell me what you want? And they didn't like that I didn't do that and I didn't give them that information. And so I think there is definitely a learning curve, because, I mean, like I said before, you're oh, what's the word? I don't want to say indoctrinated. You're used to courses being a certain way and grades being a certain way for the first 18 years of your life. And so then when you're suddenly presented with something new, it's often uncomfortable. Students are willing to give up that level of freedom because it's more comfortable to be told what to do, I think, in a lot of cases. So I have definitely had some some pushback on some things, but I don't know. It's tough, but I think the more teachers do this kind of thing, and the more, sort of, if we can disrupt the way that students are conditioned to think about things, like, the earlier we can change their thinking, then I think they will become way more comfortable with it, and we won't face that pushback.